and gentlemen, welcome to another video. And today's video is going to be a retro video about the HD 4800 series graphics card that was released 10 years ago today. Now, the reason I wanted to do this video is because today is the 10-year anniversary of one of the most disruptive products and one of the greatest GPUs that AMD or ATI has ever released. And that is the world's first 1 teraflop graphics chip and the first generation to use GDDR5 memory, which even 10 years later we still use today. Now, what the 9700 Pro did in terms of the performance range back in 2002, this is what the HD 800 4800 series did in terms of the price performance range. Now, to understand the significance of the HD 4800 series, you have to go back to the previous generation, the HD 2000 series, more specifically the HD 2900 XT GPU that AMD released. This was 6 months late, and when it was released, it could barely match the nVidia 8800 GTS in terms of performance, and it was significantly behind the 8800 GTX, NVIDIA's flagship GPU at the time. Now, with the release of the HD 4800 series, not only AMD had a $200 graphics card that was faster than the 8800 GTX, but it had the HD 4870 series, which was featured in the world's first GDDR5 memory GPU that was $100 cheaper than NVIDIA's GTX 260, and in some cases it even matched the NVIDIA's $650 GTX 280 graphics card. Given the not so great reception of the HD 2900 series of the GPUs, AMD's engineers were under great pressure to have a hand on their hands, and this was the GPU series that caused nVidia to have a loss in a long time. So that goes to show how damaged the 4800 series had in terms of revenue and profit for nVidia. One major change that AMD did in terms of strategy was, instead of focusing on large GPUs, they started to focus on small GPUs and target the $200 and $300 market range. And if you follow the GPU industry, you'd know that most graphics cards are sold in the $200 to $300 price range. So instead of trying to compete with nVidia on making large GPUs, they focus on small die GPUs, so it costs less to make, and they decide to use a faster memory, the GDDR5 memory, to make up for in terms of the performance. And this was a brilliant strategy, and as you can see, the market share went up to 40.8, almost 41%. One of the very rare instances over the past 10 years. I think it only happened 3 times in terms of quarterly market share where they crossed the 40% threshold. Now, about 3 years ago, I made a video about what AMD needs to do in order to get over 50% market share. You could look at the video. I'll put a link below the description. And if they want to get over 50% market share, they would need to produce something like a 9700 Pro, and they need to do it in 2 consecutive generations. Now, AMD might be stretched for R&D budget, so if they can't do that, at the very least, they need to produce something like the HD 4800 series, where they have the best performing GPU in the $200 to $300 market range. And if they could do that, I think they could get back to over 40% market share. As you can see from the die size, it was 260 millimeters squared, so which is less than half of the GTX 200 series, which is 576 millimeters squared. So that just shows you how efficient and affordable that AMD was able to make the HD 4800 series, and that was largely due to the fact that it was less than half the size of the GTX 200 series. So in my opinion, that was a very brilliant design in terms of what they needed to hit in terms of performance and price range. Since this is going to be a retro video, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to include 3 newish games and see how the HD 4800 series runs, basically the HD 4850 runs, and I'm going to compare 3 games from 10 years ago around the 2007-2008 era, just to see how the games performed back then on the HD 4800 series, more specifically the HD 4850. Now, one special thing about the HD 4850 is that it was one of the last generation where the mid to high-end GPU from AMD came in a single slot. Now, the benefit of using a single slot that you could fit a single slot GPU like the HD 4850 in a small form factor case, or if you have a old OEM computers from Dell or HP, they don't often have a dual slot cards that you could dual slots where you could put dual slot GPU. So since they're smaller cases, you could easily put in a single slot card, and that's pretty powerful, at least for its time back in the day. And so nowadays you'll be hard pressed to find a single slot GPU of the caliber of the 4850 in that price range in a small form factor that could fit inside a small form factor case. We're going to start off with synthetic benchmarks, and first off we have 3D Mark 06, and the HD 4850 puts up a respectable score of 10,774, and this is running on a stock Q6600 with 2 GB of DDR2 RAM, 120 GB of SSD, as well as 1 TB of standard 7200 RPM. Next up we have 3D Mark Vantage, which the 4850 gets P7037 benchmark score, which is pretty decent if you're using a stock Q6600 processor. Now you didn't overclock the Q6600, you could get probably a better score with the overclock Q6600, something above the 3 GHz range, or even a newer i5 or i7 processor. So now we're going to begin off with gaming benchmarks, and we're going to start off with Call of Duty 4, which is a popular multiplayer shooter back then. And as you can see, with everything maxed out at 4x AA and 16x anisotropic filtering at 1080p, it gets over 60 frames per second. So you could easily get 60 frames per second smooth gaming with the 4850 back then. The question everyone asked back then was, can it create crisis, and can the 4850 create crisis? And it can, even at 1080p, although not with the best frame rate, so it gets around 27 frames per second. And you have to realize that back then, even for a 4850, despite it being faster than 1800 GT, it still struggled to play Crysis at 1080p with max setting, which is be very high. But at high settings, you could theoretically get pretty somewhat playable frame rates at 27 frames per second. Now, if you want to get much better frame rates, you could easily drop it down to 1050p, and it'll become more than playable at high settings. Next up we have Far Cry 2, and Far Cry 2 is one of the first DirectX 10 games that came out, and the 4800 series was perfect to utilize this. And with everything maxed out with no AA, it gets 41 frames per second. And the reason I wanted to turn off AA is that it puts a lot more load, especially for Far Cry 2, and given the fact that I wanted to get some playable frame rates due to the fact that Far Cry 2 does take up a bit more memory, more than 512 megabit, so I wanted to have a much more smoother frame rate. So with no AA, you could definitely play Far Cry 2 maxed out at 1080p. Now we're going to move on to Metro 2033, which is similar to Crysis, and at very high settings with AAA and 16x anisotropic filtering at 1080p gets 17 frames per second. So you get similar performance with the 4850 compared to Crysis. So as a result, I wanted to try something less demanding in terms of settings. So we're going to move on to the medium settings for Metro 2033. At medium settings, we get 31 frames per second, so this is much more playable. Still have the same AAA settings at 16x anisotropic filtering and at 1080p, so this has similar behavior with respect to Crysis, except that I would say Crysis is still more demanding. But regardless, Metro 2033 can still be playable at 1080p with the HD 4850. Now we're gonna move on to newer games or newish games. and at normal preset with FXA at a 1080p, the 4850 gets 41 frames per second, which is pretty respectable for a graphics card that's 10 years old. Next, we have what is probably the most demanding of the games in our test suite, and that would be Last Light Redux. So at 1080p at the medium settings with SSAA off, about with 16 times disruptive filtering, we have around 18 frames per second. So this is why I decided to drop the resolution down to 1050p. Now at 1050p with the medium settings with SAA off and 60 times disruptive filtering, it gets 22 frames per second. So Last Light Redux is probably a game that you probably wouldn't want to play on the HD 4850, but just goes to show that how demanding Last Light Redux is. So there you go, folks. That brings conclusion to this retro review of the HD 1400 series, more specifically the HD 4850 that was released 10 years ago today. Still a capable 1080p graphics card for games, I'd say from 2010 and below, where you could play games maxed out. But as you can see from certain benchmarks for specific games like Tomb Raider, you could still play games at medium settings at 1080p, which is pretty surprising and shows how great the 4800 series architecture is. And hopefully AMD will get something like this out, where they don't get something that's top of the line, they'll get something that's in the $200 to $300 range that has awesome price to performance ratios like the HD 4800 series, and hopefully get back to something like the 40% market share range. If you're looking for a HD 4800 series graphics card for, let's say, to build a small HD PC that requires a single slot, or if you are using something like an old PC that you want to build that serves as your home theater PC, or if you have kids that you want them to play older games, I'll definitely choose the HD 4800 series GPUs to play older games, like games from the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 generation, because the 4850 and 4870 are much better graphics cards and would be a much better fit, and you'll be able to play at a much higher resolution than as opposed to getting an Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 to play games of that generation. Now, if you do want to get the HD 4850, I'll recommend you get one with 1 GB video memory, because some games like Far Cry 2 at high resolution does take a little bit more than 512 megabit, and if you have something less than that, it does stutter in some cases. So I'll definitely recommend getting the HD 4850 with 1 GB or more, and that same thing applies to the HD 4870 with something that's more than 512 megabit. And you could probably get the 4850 for around $15 to $20 off of eBay. And I would prefer, and the best thing to do is that if you do want to get a 4800 series GPUs, to get the 4870, which will be at least 10 to 15% faster. Anyways, I hope you have enjoyed this video and look back at the 4800 series from 10 years ago, and what a disruptive product and what a great product it was, and it really caught nVidia by surprise, and where they had to lower their price to match the price of the 4800 series. And hopefully we'll get back to the competitive scenarios we had over 10 years ago. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.